It was the kind of morning that felt like nothing more than a continuation of every other. A low-hanging fog that blurred the lines between the ocean and the sky, and a quiet coastal diner where nothing ever really changed. The kind of place that had witnessed hundreds of the same slow mornings. But for Avery West, this was far from an ordinary morning. She sat tucked into the corner booth, barely noticed by the other patrons. In her late 20s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor that seemed a little too poised for a small-town diner. She could have been anyone. She could have been anyone, that is, until the moment that made her someone else. A man, young, brash, and just a little too sure of himself, slipped into the booth next to hers. He was wearing the weight of his Navy SEAL training like armor, and it didn't take long for him to spot her. Chris Jansen, a SEAL with a swagger that made it clear he thought he could walk through the world without consequence, leaned back in his seat, eyeing her across the table. Avery barely looked up, just long enough to register the gleam in his eyes. She hadn't even finished her coffee before he made his move. "Hey, you look like you could use some company," Chris said, his voice laced with that familiar bravado of a man who knew he was used to getting what he wanted. "What's your name?" Avery glanced up at him finally, her gaze steady, unwavering. She didn't answer immediately, and in that moment, Chris took it as a challenge. He leaned in a little closer, his arrogance making his presence almost suffocating. "I said, what's your name?" he repeated, a teasing edge to his voice. Avery's eyes narrowed slightly, but she still didn't respond, her fingers idly tracing the rim of her coffee cup. Chris took this as an opening. "Come on, don't tell me you're one of those types. The cold, mysterious ones. Let's be honest, you don't look like you belong here. You look more like someone who's got a story." Avery finally set her cup down, her movements slow and deliberate, and for the first time, she let her gaze hold his. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but sharp enough to cut through the air. "You don't know anything about me," she said, her words deliberate, every syllable carrying a weight. Chris chuckled, leaning back in his seat, clearly amused. He didn't know why, but something about this woman intrigued him. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, the subtle air of something that could cut through all his swagger with a single look. "You know, I've been in places where people don't last long because they get too cocky," Avery continued, her eyes flicking briefly to the window before returning to him. "Not all stories are meant to be told." Chris's amusement faltered for just a moment, though he tried to brush it off. "Is that a threat?" he asked, his tone now more a challenge than a flirtation. Avery didn't answer right away. She merely stood up, her gaze still locked with his, and as she turned to walk out of the diner, Chris stood up too, following her with a sense of superiority that only the naive have when they think they hold all the power. He didn't get far. He reached for her shoulder, just a light touch, to get her attention, and that was all it took. Avery spun around, her body moving like a finely tuned weapon, her hand catching his wrist in an unbreakable grip. Before he could even process what was happening, she twisted his arm, forcing him into a hold that slammed him against the table, his head cracking against the hardwood. The room fell into a stunned silence. It was over in an instant, and Chris, dazed, slowly tried to push himself up, but Avery's unshaken stance told him everything he needed to know. "You thought this was a game," Avery said, her voice colder than the morning air outside. "You didn't realize who you were messing with." Chris blinked, still reeling from the speed of the entire exchange. He had never met anyone who could disarm him with such ease. Never, not in all his training, not in all his missions. And as the fog began to clear from his vision, he realized just how badly he had misjudged her. This wasn't some random woman in a diner. This was someone who had been through things he couldn't even begin to imagine. You're not just some civilian," Chris muttered, struggling to stand. Avery didn't even flinch. "No," she replied, her voice now an even, chilling whisper. "I'm far from it." She left the diner without a word more, leaving Chris standing there, humiliated and confused, while the quiet buzz of the diner slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Avery West had walked out of that diner just like she had walked in, unnoticed, unreadable. But as Chris stood there, piecing together the fragments of their brief encounter, one thing was certain. He would never forget the woman who had broken him without even trying. The cold air hit Avery's face as she stepped out of the diner, her boots crunching on the gravel of the parking lot. The world outside felt vast, the early morning mist curling around her, hugging the coastline like a shroud. Her steps were steady, the kind of movements that came with years of training, measured, deliberate. She wasn't in any hurry. The day hadn't truly begun for her, and this was just one of many stops in a routine that had become as familiar as her own reflection. But the diner, with its faded charm and small-town warmth, was a place that still held some surprises. Not for her, not really. She had long ago learned the art of staying invisible in plain sight, blending in with the backdrop of normalcy while concealing everything about herself beneath layers of composure and restraint. Still, she hadn't expected someone like Chris Jansen, a man whose arrogance was so thick, so loud, that it practically reverberated in the air around him. He had walked in with the confidence of someone who believed the world revolved around him. That cocky, youthful swagger, so familiar to those who wore their service like a crown, had made him easy to spot from the moment he entered. He was the kind of man who assumed power came with uniform, that rank alone would demand respect. She had seen men like him before, and for the most part, they didn't get the lesson they needed until they were left standing on the other side of a lesson they hadn't known was coming. The sun had barely begun to rise, and the sleepy town seemed to hold its breath, as if it too was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Avery moved across the parking lot, her mind focused, but for a brief moment, she allowed herself to remember the sound of Chris's voice. It had been more than a challenge, more than an attempt to flex some muscles he didn't fully understand. It was an invitation, a loud, brash invitation that told her everything she needed to know about him. He was used to being the predator, never the prey. The idea of someone else being in control had unsettled him, which was exactly why she had acted. Her fingers itched for the familiarity of the weapon at her side, a constant companion when the world didn't let her blend in. It wasn't the first time she had been underestimated. It wouldn't be the last. She had learned to walk with that invisible weight, the one that said, "Don't mess with me," without having to speak a word. She reached her car, the engine starting with a low hum. It was a simple, unremarkable vehicle, like everything else about her life. There was nothing extraordinary about it, nothing that would make anyone stop and look twice. That's how it had to be. No one needed to know who she was or what she had done. She wasn't here to be remembered. She was here to keep watching. A glance in the rearview mirror caught her reflection, and for a moment, she allowed herself to think of Chris Jansen again. His face, still slightly dazed, his pride hanging on the edge of humiliation, like someone who had just learned the world wasn't as soft as he had been led to believe. She had no doubt that he would walk away from this with a lesson, but it wasn't about how to fight or how to win. It was about understanding who the real threats were. It wasn't about the bravado or the training. It was about knowing when to strike and when to step back. And Chris had learned the hard way that not everything could be fought with sheer muscle. The fog that had rolled in over the town began to lift, the sun breaking through the haze and scattering light across the ocean's surface. It was beautiful in its own way, this stretch of coastline. Avery knew it well. It was a place where things could happen under the radar. A place where she could sit unnoticed and wait. She wasn't sure how long she'd be here. The mission was still underway, and it had taken her to too many places to count. She hadn't stayed in one spot long enough to form anything permanent. She had learned to move like a shadow, taking only what she needed, leaving nothing behind. As her car moved down the winding road, the scene at the diner faded behind her. But Chris Jansen's face remained in her mind's eye, his confusion and frustration still etched there. It wasn't just his arrogance that had made him easy to manipulate. It was his own misunderstanding of the world around him. Men like him, men who thought power came from rank or uniform, rarely saw the ones who walked in silence. She had learned the hard way, too, that power was about control. Control over yourself, control over your emotions, your movements. And the best way to gain that control was to keep everything close to the chest, to move quietly, to act when it was necessary, and never before. The mission was still in its early stages, and the road ahead was long. But she had already learned that every encounter, every moment, could reveal something important. She would carry that lesson with her, just as she carried everything else she had learned in the shadows. Chris Jansen would be a footnote in her life. He would learn his lesson, probably with a bruised ego and a few scars to remind him that not everyone he crossed paths with would let him dominate the conversation. But for Avery, He was just another reminder of how easy it was to hide in plain sight, to watch from the shadows while the world went on as if nothing extraordinary was happening. For her, it was just another day in a long line of them, another mission wrapped in a veil of normalcy, and no one would ever know the truth. As the day unfolded, Avery continued her drive, the coast stretching out on either side of her. The road ahead seemed endless, but she didn't mind. Time didn't move in the same way for her as it did for others. For most people, the journey from one place to another could be measured in miles, hours, and minutes. For Avery, it was measured in moments of silence and observation, in quiet moments of reflection. She didn't rush through her days. She let them come at their own pace. The world around her was simply a backdrop to the life she led, an existence woven through the shadows, always moving but never seen. She had learned long ago that the most important things often went unnoticed. Chris Jansen, and his overconfident arrogance, had been nothing more than an interruption, a brief spark in an otherwise steady rhythm. He had been a reminder of the kind of men she had spent years outsmarting, the kind of soldiers who thought strength was defined by physical prowess or the rank sewn onto a uniform. But Avery knew better. Strength was something far more subtle. It was in the ability to control yourself, to remain calm when chaos surrounded you, and to wait for the exact moment to act. Her thoughts drifted back to the diner, to the startled look on Chris's face when she had disarmed him, figuratively and literally. His pride had been shattered in an instant, but that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that he'd learned a lesson that might stay with him for years. He had assumed that because of his training, his status, he was invincible, a force to be reckoned with. What he hadn't realized was that the real power wasn't in the training, the rank, or the uniform. It was in the restraint, in the understanding that there was more to combat than brute force. Avery's fingers tightened on the wheel as she thought about Chris again. He would leave the diner confused, no doubt replaying the incident in his mind over and over, trying to understand what had gone wrong. He wouldn't realize it right away, but eventually, he would understand. She wasn't just a woman in a diner. She wasn't just someone who had crossed his path by accident. She had been a lesson. And those kinds of lessons, the ones you learn through experience rather than instruction, stayed with you for life. Avery had no doubt that Chris would never underestimate someone again, not after today. The landscape outside the window shifted, the road winding through small, sleepy towns, then cutting across fields and forests, the edges of civilization fading as she moved farther from the coast. She didn't know where she was headed, not exactly. But that was the beauty of it. The world was wide, full of possibilities and unknowns. She had learned to embrace the uncertainty, to let the journey lead her instead of trying to control it. It wasn't always easy, but it was the way she had been trained. Always adapting, always shifting, never allowing herself to be caught off guard. Her car hummed steadily as it ate up the miles, the engine almost like a lullaby in the background. A comforting noise that reminded her that she was always moving, even when it felt like she was standing still. Avery had become accustomed to the isolation, to the feeling of being both a part of the world and apart from it. She had lived many lives within one, each one a shadow of the last, each one a different set of rules, a different set of expectations. She wasn't the same person she had been when she joined the military, and she wasn't the same person she had been when she left it. She had shed many skins along the way, each one falling away like the pages of a book she no longer needed to read. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the road, Avery let her thoughts settle on the mission she was currently on. It was complex, intricate, and dangerous, but it was nothing she hadn't faced before. She had learned to keep her distance, to remain invisible. No one needed to know who she was or what she had done, and that was the way it had to be. In this line of work, the less people knew, the better. Her ability to blend into the background had kept her alive and kept her from making the kinds of connections that could lead to vulnerabilities. But there was a part of her that couldn't completely shut off the human side. It was why she had chosen the quiet life, why she had come to places like this, where no one knew her name, where no one asked too many questions. Still, there were moments when she allowed herself to remember. Not the big things, not the things that defined her past. She had long ago learned to forget the bloodshed, the loss, and the years of relentless missions. But in moments like this, when the world was quiet and the road stretched on for miles, She allowed herself to remember the little things, the things that had kept her going. The smell of the salt air in coastal towns, the sound of the ocean at night, the way the light shifted in the early morning hours just before the world woke up. These were the things that kept her grounded. These were the moments that reminded her why she did what she did. Chris Jansen would probably be okay. He might be bruised, his pride wounded, but he would move on. The world would move on. And Avery would be a ghost, slipping through the cracks, leaving only the faintest trace of her existence in places like this. Diner tables, small coastal towns, and lives that brushed against hers only for a moment. She had come to terms with that. The silence that followed her wasn't a burden, it was a freedom she could carry with her, wherever the road took her. As the night began to fall and the stars started to peek out from the black sky, Avery's mind shifted to the mission once again. It was a long road ahead, and the shadows were deepening. But for now, she allowed herself a rare moment of peace. The lesson she had taught Chris Jansen was one she would carry with her, too. The world was full of men like him, men who thought they could bulldoze their way through life, thinking strength was about size, speed, or rank. But Avery knew better. Strength wasn't always visible. Sometimes, it was the quiet ones, the ones who could wait, the ones who understood when to move and when to remain still. And as she drove into the night, her eyes on the horizon, she knew that she was one of them.